Good evening, everyone who joined us. Thank you for joining us this evening in this webinar of Sallux and Jubilee Center. We're doing this in cooperation with them, and we're very grateful for that cooperation. This evening, the topic is a webinar, Neighbors in Arms, Rethinking European-African Counterterrorism Partnership. We'll have seen many of the issues on the news that will be touched on in this webinar. We're very honored to have a retired General Stefan Kabanda here with us, and we thank him very much for joining us this evening and sharing his extensive experience on this topic with us. He can also tell a bit more, I think, about his impressive CV. And I just want to open this webinar with a short few sentences from the Bible, as we are both Christian clubs, both we, the Sallux and Jubilee Center. And then I will turn to Micah 6, the verses 6 to 8. It's very short. And it says, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with thousands of rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" And then the core sentence is, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Often we seek it in all kinds of material goods, but ultimately what is important is to act justly and to love mercy. But in this case, in the context of this webinar, is I think to act justly, to do justice to a situation. I think it's the core of what this webinar will share. So with that having said, I'm happy to give the floor to General Kabanda and thank him again for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. You can hear me?
Absolutely.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And I think everybody. So that should be in order.
Okay, that is good. So I'm General Stephen Kabanda, retired from Zambia. I've been introduced. I've had 37 years of military service in my country, and I've also worked with the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States as a peace and security expert. And I'm also a Christian. And in my heart, the issue of counterterrorism is something that I'm passionate about and something that I would like to see help resolve. Just as a way of introduction, I'm talking about Neighbors in Arms, rethinking the EU-Africa counterterrorism partnership, or in general terms, the Western and African counterterrorism partnership, because I know that apart from the EU, there are other players like the Americans and the British who may not necessarily be part of the EU, but who've also contributed to this. So as a way of introduction, we all know when the Lord Jesus Christ tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, he reminds us that compassion has no borders. The Samaritan saw a man in distress on a road fraught with danger, a man who was not from his tribe, from his faith or nation, yet he stopped, tended his wounds, and ensured his recovery. Today, the road from, if you think about it, the road from the Sahel to the Mediterranean, from the Great Lakes to Cabo Delgado, is similarly treacherous. Terrorism, extremism, and fragility leaves states bleeding on the roadside of global politics. The question facing Europe and Africa is simple, but quite profound. Who will stop to help, and how? Now, the EU-Africa counterterrorism partnership is often presented as an act of solidarity, a neighborly gesture. But as we examine its evolution, we ask whether this partnership heals the wounded or merely manages the symptoms. We want to see whether indeed what is being done is healing the wounds or it's merely managing the symptoms. Now, we can look at a decade of unfinished battles. If we consider the past 10 years, we can say that the EU's engagement in Africa as a security landscape intensified after about 2011, following the collapse of Libya and the rise of extremist networks across the Sahel. Of course, the creation of the EU training mission in Mali in 2013 and its companion, the missions marked the beginning of a sustained European presence on African soil. These missions aimed to professionalize local forces and strengthen state capacity. And as a retired soldier myself, I'll tell you that these missions were welcomed because as soldiers, we like new equipment, we like the toys, we like all the things that come with deployment. Yet, as of 2025, the Sahel still remains unstable with a withdrawal of international forces, as we know, from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and the juntas in both countries have asserted national authority. The Bakken and Takuba missions have ended. The UN MINUSMA as a mission has also departed, and non-state security actors, notably the African Corps or Wagner, have stepped in to fill this gap. Now, this really exposes an uncomfortable truth. External interventions, no matter how well intended, cannot substitute local legitimacy. European efforts have often been shaped by immigration pressures and domestic politics rather than African strategic priorities. Now, I say this because both the European partners and the African partners both have interests. And I know that there's a lot of pressure, for instance, on the European side, to curb illegal immigration. And one of the best ways of doing this is seen that if the fight against terrorism is intensified in the Sahel, this maybe will block these illegal inflows of immigration. But of course, those are European priorities, and the threat to Europe is real, because Europe cannot obviously take all the immigrants that are flowing into it. It's not possible. Now, let's look at a few specific cases. I'll look at Libya and the immigration security nexus. The case of Libya illustrates how blurred the lines between counterterrorism and immigration control have become. After the fall of Gaddafi, the EU sought, indeed, the European Union sought to contain instability through initiatives like the European Union Naval Force in the Mediterranean and Operation Sophia and Operation Irene. Now, while these missions disrupted smuggling networks, they also revealed Europe's fixation on preventing irregular migration rather than addressing Libya's fractured governance. African partners, especially within the African Union, Peace and Security Council, have consistently argued that security responses must be complemented by political dialogue and inclusive reconstruction. Yet, coordination between the African Union and the EU still remains patchy, and Libya's instability continues to fuel both jihadist movement in the Sahel and migration flows towards Europe's southern border. Now, I'm saying this because if you look at it from the African perspective, African needs to develop. most of the people that come into Europe as immigrants, if they had opportunities in Africa, for instance, there would be no need for them to come. So there's need to both look at the development in Africa so that Africans have opportunities there, especially the young people. Then they will not be motivated to cross over into Europe. Now let's look at the Sahel's warning. We can see from what happened in the Sahel that fragility outpaces firepower. Now, across the Sahel, groups affiliated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda have adopted faster than states can respond. They exploit weak governance, ethnic tensions, and economic despair. Despite billions of euros in external support, including through the European Peace Facility and the Ndiki Global Europe, the region's security architecture remains fragmented. European and African leaders have learned, sometimes painfully, that terrorism cannot be bombed out of existence. It feeds on marginalization and state absence. A lesson that echoes with the biblical story of the Good Samaritan is that compassion requires proximity, not just policy. The EU's challenge is to move from funding and training to genuine partnership, one that listens before acting and empowers before prescribing. In other words, the underlying factors, the drivers of terrorism needs to be addressed. And most of them are due to poor governance. Once these are addressed, then it will be easier to come up with policies that will work. Now, let's look at a few lessons from Southern Africa. I come from Zambia, so it's easier for me to draw lessons from there. Now, in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado, the insurgency that began in 2017 exposed another dimension of the partnership. Initially, if you remember, Mozambique was reluctant to invite external intervention. They thought that they would be able to handle the situation. But as the crisis deepened, we saw Southern African Development Community and Rwanda deployed forces in Mozambique. And they achieved quite some significant territorial gains, disrupting this insurgency. This intervention, which was largely African-led, demonstrated agility and ownership that European missions in Africa often lack. The EU later provided financial support through the European Peace Facility, marking a turning point. We saw a European willingness to back African solutions rather than lead them. I remember in that period, we saw the EU fund the production of the development of a counterterrorism strategy for Mozambique, which really helped. It also funded training for Mozambique, for SADC. Last year, I think, towards the end, the EU funded Rwanda again, just to keep this going on. Similarly, in the DRC, SADC forces entered the Eastern Theater alongside Congolese troops. Now, whilst Rwanda's involvement through the M23 conflict continues to test regional diplomacy, this was also an effort that we can see of African forces trying to intervene. Now, these experiences underscore that African states are not passive recipients of security aid, but active shapers of their destiny. Now, let's look at when policy meets politics, conditionalities and perceptions. Now, the EU prides itself in promoting good governance, human rights, accountability in its security partnerships. Instruments like the Ndiki Global Europe Framework and the European Peace Facility include strict eligibility criteria. However, in practice, these conditions are sometimes perceived by African partners as paternalistic or politically selective. From an African perspective, conditionalities can appear to undermine sovereignty. From the European perspective, of course, it safeguards taxpayers' money and prevents complicity in abuses. The European Peace Facility, for example, also supports the Ukrainian war, and therefore it's quite competitive. It's not easy to get funding from this facility. So the tension is real, and this is precisely where the partnership needs to mature. A genuine alliance must acknowledge must acknowledge asymmetries of power without reproducing them. The Good Samaritan did not lecture the wounded traveler about his choices. He lifted him up, paid the innkeeper, and ensured recovery. In counter-terrorism cooperation, both continents, that's Europe and Africa, must find a spirit of practical compassion that respects urgency while upholding shared values and interests. Now, looking at the current scenario, I've got a few suggestions of policy recommendations. On the European side, there is need to recenter partnership on equality. For instance, there is need to redefine capacity building as core development. That's a shift from donor-recipient model to a co-designing security program with African Union organs and regional economic communities. What I mean here is when there is a challenge, it is important that these programs are designed together between the European funders as well as and the recipients. This has worked quite well. If you look at, for instance, the multinational joint task forces that the EU has funded and helped equip and train in the Chad Basin, for example. There's also need to invest in prevention, not protection. To allocate a fixed share of the European Peace Facility and Indic Europe funds to early warning systems, youth employment, and digital governance in fragile areas. This will address the underlying issues or the underlying drivers to terrorism. Then there's also need to link critical raw materials, MOUs, for instance, to governance compacts. Resource partnerships must include transparency clauses and community benefit frameworks to prevent conflict over extraction. I'll give you an example. When I was working with the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, there was a project on critical raw materials that was done between the organization and UNDP in Burkina Faso. Now, this project was a project to do with artisanal miners. Now, this project created so much employment for the youth that the extremists did not have people to recruit for their cause. It was a spin-off of this project. When we were doing the evaluation, we discovered that we had actually benefited in more ways than one. So then it's important that transparency clauses and community benefit frameworks are included in these critical raw material MOUs. There's also need to enhance coordination between, for instance, the External Action Service and the AU Peace and Security Department. A standing AU-EU Joint Operations Cell, for instance, could harmonize both training, logistics, and evaluation. There's also need to communicate success stories to the European public. After all, this is European taxpayers' money. So counter-narratives that portray Africa solely through crisis and highlight highlight stabilization missions supported by Europe. The success stories need to be taught to the European public so that they see that what is being done is a success story. Of course, the African Union and member states also need to change in terms of policy. There is need to build enduring sovereignty. For instance, there is need to strengthen the African peace and security architecture. If we talk about the Africa Standby Force and the Continental Early Warning System, for instance, these concepts are good, but they are still more or less on an ad hoc coalitions. They exist on paper, but on ground, they are not there. So the AU, the African Union must therefore develop an AU joint capability in equipment, acquisition, and interoperability. Now, what I'm talking about are concepts that are agreed within Africa, but we see that they are not implemented. There's also need to institutionalize the AU Fund for Peace. We need, as Africans, to have our own funding for peace, not to always depend on partners to help. regular contributions by member states would ensure a predictable financing and credibility in negotiations with partners. If, for instance, Africa was to say, look, this mission will cost us, for instance, maybe 20 million euros, but as African, we've got 15 million euros. I'm sure the European partners would be more than willing to contribute the 5 million because they see that the African Union is owning the process. But of course, the story is not like that on the African side. You find member states who say a lot of things but do not put their money where their weights are. Then there's also need to integrate counterterrorism strategies into development planning. The security risk assessment should be integrated into the Agenda 2063 flagship projects for Africa. There's also need to promote interregional solidarity. The lessons from SADC and the Great Lakes and the Lake Chad Basin should inform ECOWAS, IGAD, and the East African community responses to terrorism. Because we have seen how SADC responded. We've seen how the Central African states have responded in the Chad Basin. This can be replicated in other regions as well. There's also need to invest in strategic communication. Narratives of resilience and African leadership must accompany battlefield gains to sustain legitimacy. So just like the European side needs to talk about the successes of the European investment, African side also needs to do the same. Now, let's look at some parallels that can complement these pathways. Now, both continents must walk their roads side by side, each carrying its share of responsibility. Europe must provide predictable resources and respect the African agency. Africa, on the other hand, must uphold accountability and results. Now, the intersection point is shared interests, not shared guilt. After all, European partnership to develop Africa will give hope for the youthful population in Africa. Yeah, and also, we all acknowledge that no matter how good the intentions may be, Europe cannot manage the immigration inflows from Africa, like I said earlier. In conclusion, what I would say is that when Africa and Europe look across the Mediterranean, they see not an ocean, but a mirror. Each reflects the other's hopes and fears. The test of our partnership is whether we can move from crisis response to community building, from reactive neighbors to being responsible ones. Like the Good Samaritan, we are called to act not because the wounded lie on our side of the road, but because they are human. Counterterrorism at its best is not an act of power. It is an act of mercy guided by justice. If the European Union or the West and Africa can learn this, to pair realism with compassion, efficiency with empathy, then the partnership will not merely deter terror, it will inspire peace. I think I'll end there. I hope that maybe you've picked one or two points, and if there are any questions, I'm willing for us to discuss and look at them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it was very clarifying and helpful, and many practical examples, and some of them, well, really surprising. Also, the one example I forgot, a specific country, which you told that there were so many young people who got a job that the terrorists were having trouble in finding new recruits, which is exactly, of course, what you want, because in that case, you don't need to kill these people, young people, anymore when they try to do bad things. So this is, of course, way better in every possible respect. And from a small personal note, I've seen the same mechanism in Iraq, for example, where many young guys were recruited by ISIS, not because they were so ideologically in tune with that, but, well, at least somebody offered a couple of dollars, which they otherwise didn't. And I think this is very recognizable, I'm afraid. So this is also showing our responsibility indeed to work structurally together instead of ad hoc, and to find and to see each other indeed in the mirror, also in the terms of human dignity, to see the equal human dignity between Europe and Africa. I think this is absolutely important. So there are people in the room. If you have a question, you can drop your question in the Q&A box. So there is a Q&A box next to share, and you could, if you want, ask a question there or raise your hand. I also will need some assistance from my colleague Christian Meinen, which I thank that he is available this evening, and also thank Christian because he brought us here together, because it was his work and knowing you that thanks to that you are here this evening. Thank you very much. So if there is any question from any of the participants, I see a number of participants. We also know that some participants who wanted to join us couldn't because of some technical trouble. But they will get the YouTube clip and be able to listen later on and share in this wisdom. So are there any questions from those participants present? If not, I will have one in any case. So if there are any question, you can use the Q&A box or raise your hand. If not, then I will start with a question right away. I got one actually from Christian, and I think it's a very good question. What part of the peace facility is now going to African projects, and how much was that before 2022? So the question is a little bit like, what is the percentage of European attention in this for Africa? How have you any idea about that? Before and after 2022. I am not aware of how these projects are shaped, but you are. Maybe you can give an answer to that.
All right. Okay, I may not have the exact figures, but I can share what I know. For instance, from what I know, the assistance measures adopted in Africa, the Mozambican Armed Forces and EU training mission in Mozambique, that was about 89 million euros. That's ground and amphibious mobility, assets, technical devices, and a field hospital. Then I know that for the Rwanda Defense Force in Mozambique, 20 million euros, collective and personal equipment, costs related to the strategic airlift. Then we also have Armed Forces of the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, 27 million euros. That's for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and UAVs. Then Ghana Armed Forces, 33.25 million euros. Medical imagery, engineering, electronic warfare. The DRC, 20 million euros, individual equipment for the 31st Rapid Reaction Brigade. The Republic of Congo, 5 million euros in training. There's quite a lot. In other words, what I'm trying to say, Christian, is that Africa has benefited immensely from the European Peace Facility. Much more, I think, than what most people know. The EU or the West has invested in the counterterrorism fight. I also looked at not necessarily the European Peace Facility. If you remember, in 2014, the British government supported the Nigerian armed forces after the Chibok girls were kidnapped. There was an operation there, I think it was Operation, if I remember correctly, it must have been Operation Turas, I think, where they provided surveillance and intelligence. And in some quarters, they say that they actually did locate those girls, but of course, there was a challenge between the British and the Nigerians. They couldn't go in for the rescue. But afterwards, they turned that assistance into counterterrorism training for Nigeria. So what I'm saying is the West has spent millions and billions of euros in African counterterrorism fights, and it is quite commendable. What is required, though, what works, is for the two to have a partnership where there is ownership of these projects. And I think the European Peace Facility is good because the country has to identify what they need, and then an evaluation is done and they are assisted. I may not know the exact percentage before 2020, before the Ukrainian war, and now. I may not give the correct figures, but I'm aware about some of those projects that I've highlighted there.
That's very good. Thank you very much. That sounds very, very clear. At the same time, somehow it doesn't produce the results in many situations that we would like to see, and you have explained many of the background of that. If you look at this, right, if you take a bird's eye view of the whole situation a little bit, this is the best I can do in any case with my limited knowledge. And if I would ask you, right, so we make you now, so to say, it's a bit of a joke, of course, we make you now the head of EAS, and you can decide right now where we should start in this. And so that, because if I look to that, right, it's such a complicated situation, especially for us Europeans who didn't grow up there, who don't know, we will never know as much as people from Africa know. Where should we start? You said ownership is very important, and I was also thinking about ethnic components. This is something where Sallux is very much interested in, as you may know. But where should we start? Where should we start to do it better? Because we cannot start on everything at once. So where should we start?
That's a very good question, and I think the place to start is to first identify the drivers of terrorism in Africa. What really is causing terrorism in Africa? Once we know these drivers, then we can address the root cause of these drivers. Like I said, we cannot bomb terrorism out of Africa, or no matter how many troops you deploy, no matter what you do, it is an asymmetric warfare. And it's a challenge, not just for the European side, but the Africans as well. Remember, we are fighting an almost invisible enemy. But maybe just a few points that I've thought about. For instance, mostly it has to do with governance and legitimacy deficiency. Now, in Africa, sometimes in some countries, corruption is taken as a norm. People have accepted that it is, for lack of a better word, it is like a standard practice by the population. And because of this, it breeds hopelessness. And sometimes the state itself acts against its own citizens. Now, when this happens, it erodes public trust in the government, and it's easy for terrorists to recruit young men or people out of this because they are dissatisfied. So one of the things that needs to be done is to have a parallel approach. Much as we are having gains on the battlefield, we also need to reform the governance systems in some of these countries. That will really help. So if there's a strategic connection between the fight the physical fight on the ground, and the political and governance fight will be gaining somewhere. Then the other challenge I've seen also is social economic marginalization. Sometimes people feel marginalized. They are not part and parcel of economically of what is happening. They are not benefiting from the minerals, for instance. And so because they're not benefiting, they look at the West. I'll give you a typical example. I think 2019, I was privileged to serve in MINUSMA in Mali. And talking to the locals had this perception that the European mission was there they were stealing minerals from Mali. Now, the locals had a wrong impression about what was happening. As far as they were concerned, these Europeans have come to protect European companies and to steal gold from Mali. That's why they are here. Not realizing that that force was there to help them fight the insurgents. Now, what I'm saying is, where to start from is we need to ensure that we help not just on the governance side, also on the socio-economic side. The local populations, the Africans, should benefit from these critical raw materials, from what is being extracted out of there. And it's worse now with social media because now there's a lot of misinformation. So people are misinformed, they don't know what is happening, and so they believe such things. So what I'm saying is, if we can address the root causes of the insecurity, then our victory will be greater. Sometimes there's also a time, sometimes when a proper assessment is not done, and sometimes the Western partners tend to support governments that do not seem to have legitimacy, governments that do not uphold the values that the Western countries uphold, like governance, human rights. Countries that have a poor human rights record, but they are seen by the populations as a darling of the West. So that becomes a challenge. Maybe in a nutshell, what I'm saying is we need to look at the drivers of terrorism, address those as much as we are addressing the gains on the battlefield. Then the communities, the Africans, will see this as a fight, not just for European interests, but for African interests as well.
Yeah, that seems to be the key issue here, right? To really look to this from the inside out instead of the outside in, if I speak it as a European, right?
Yes.
Because I recognize this from the Middle East dossiers. We often work with the wrong actors, right? And if we sometimes work with good actors, we then quickly switch back to the wrong actors because that seems to be expedient. But then we basically should not be surprised that the problems persist. Because on the other hand, I was also thinking that, yeah, and I think Europeans can avoid to work with the governments that have no legitimacy, but what we cannot do, in my opinion, is that we increase the legitimacy of existing governments if they are legitimate. I mean, there is a certain limit to what we can do, right? In that sense, also because we need to respect, as you said, the agency of the African populations. I think that what you say, that I fully concur, fully agree, but there is a certain point that the Europeans have to say, look, this is up to you.
No, that is true, because ultimately, no one is going to solve problems of Africa apart from Africans themselves. People will assist out of goodwill, but ultimately, what is expected is for Africans to be responsible. I'll give you, and I like the way that you opened this webinar when you quoted from, I think it's Micah chapter 6, verse 8, where the Bible says that the Lord has told you what is required of you, O man, that you should have mercy and justice and walk humbly before your God. Much as we are supposed to obey our rulers also have a responsibility to be accountable to the people that they are governing. So the leaders in Africa need to be accountable to their population. They need, much as the African population is supposed to be subservient to their leaders, but their leaders also need to know that they are accountable both to God and to the people that they govern. That way, they will realize the poverty that is there. I'll give you a typical example, and I'm not saying it's possible it can happen. You find maybe a leader is corrupt, and he gets a bribe, say, of 20 million euros, for instance, so that maybe the critical raw materials are extracted out of that country. For instance, maybe tax-free, they are given a tax holiday. But then the people in that country are not benefiting from the critical raw materials that are being extracted from that community. It is very easy for extremists and terrorists to convince and recruit that population, because they will tell them that, look, after all the oil and gas from your region, you are not benefiting from it. It's just going straight to Europe. But if a leader is responsible, he will think about his country. He will think about his people. He will think about the interests of his country, so that even when they sign MOUs or go into business agreements with Europe or other Western countries, the interests of that country and the interests of the Western partners are both taken into account. I think that would work out a lot better. But ultimately, much as Europe and the West have been a good Samaritan to Africa, Africa also needs to be responsible for its own security. Just like in the parable of the Good Samaritan that I started with, the Samaritan helped not because that man was from his tribe or from his religion, no, but because the man was in need. And that is exactly how Europe has behaved towards Africa. But now Africa also needs to take responsibility and put in certain policies and measures to fight the scourge of terrorism.
So if we do not sign stupid or bad MOUs, which we really should not, and we have done that too many times and still do, I'm afraid. So there is our responsibility, clear enough. And also, I think it's important that our taxpayers understand these dynamics. So I have also another question coming in from Ruben Alarcon of Jubilee Center. Because he is officially a panelist, he could not write it down in the Q&A, so I would just repeat it here for you to hear. So Ruben is asking this. As we talk about corruption, and Ruben, his background is very interesting in this, by the way, because he is actually from Venezuela, and he did our previous session. So he's not speaking from a typical Europe knows all point of view, just to clarify where he's coming from. This is his question. As we talk about corruption as the norm, does the Christian faith hold any power of the people's moral compass? So obviously Ruben has some experience from South America on this, and maybe that reflects in his question in this case. So what he is asking, whether given that so many Africans are Christians, how does that affect their view on corruption?
Thank you very much, Ruben, for that question. Now remember, corruption is sin, and it is, and I think, much as people may profess the Christian faith, and it's unfortunate that for Africa, Africans will say they are Christians, but they may not be living the Christian life. they will profess to be Christians, but they may actually do the totally different things. So when we say Africans are Christians, it's in general terms. And unfortunately, in Africa, we have got a saying that when you are eating groundnuts or nuts, if there's one rotten nut that you eat with all the good nuts, everything will be bad in the mouth. So there is this label of corrupt African leaders that is labeled on most African leaders because of a few that are corrupt. And unfortunately, it is very difficult for us to say that we'll reach a point in Africa when we'll have completely eradicated corruption. I know that even in Europe, even in South America, corruption is still there. What is important, I think, is for us to have leaders of integrity, leaders that will stand, that will uphold the rule of law, leaders that will not be compromised, leaders that will not allow for state capture. Because it's a wide question, because sometimes in Africa, for instance, because the population is poor, when it comes to elections, political parties may be funded by people with business interests. And so they invest in these political parties. And when they take over power, they would want to be treated in a particular way. So all these are challenges. So we need to ensure that there are laws that safeguard the interests of the country. There are laws that put our African leaders to task, and that we ourselves as Africans also demand this of our leaders, that they should be transparent, they should show integrity if we are to develop. I'm in Brussels right now. That's because I came here for work. And if you look at the way that Europe is organized, all of us as Africans would want to have our cities look like Brussels or like New York City. And it is possible. It is doable. But as long as we do not demand this of our leadership or demand this as a continent, we'll continue trying to get to Europe to get a better life, when we can actually have a better life right there where we are from in Africa. I know, Ruben, that it's a very big question. I may not have answered it maybe to your satisfaction, but those are some of the things that you could consider when you look at that question.
Well, thank you. I think this is a very clear answer. And my colleague here says that I should not say anything about Brussels. But yeah, I think I totally get your point, and it's very clear. Jokes on particular cities aside, it's very clear point what you're making. Miss Bustra is asking the following. She has two questions, so I will be mentioning here. So she is apologizing that she joined a bit late, but she is interested in what you think of Trump's interesting statements regarding Nigeria, and also when it is about moving to a very different topic, or kind of adjacent. So we talk about grassroots solution to the problem of terrorism, because it's also basically part of the big idea, I think, here, and is correctly mentioned, I think. What do you think what the role of the church in Africa should be, or is or should be? I think both questions are very good. So the one on, well, the statements are coming from Trump, and then the other one, I think, even more clear, that what is the role of the church in Africa in this. I also think the role of the church in Africa is often that of victim, I'm afraid, but maybe it could be a bit more than that.
Okay. Thank you very much for those very interesting questions. I'll start with the American president's statements about Christians being killed in Nigeria, and his threat to send a military force to protect the believers in the northern part of Nigeria. I know that President Trump is a very transactional president. From what I've observed and speaking from the little experience I've seen of his presidency, is very transactional. And you can look at maybe his tariffs and all the things that he says. He says things sometimes to get a reaction and then see what happens. I do not personally, and I'm speaking as an individual, thank God I'm not representing any organization. I do not see the US invading Nigeria to protect believers, so to speak. But what I see is that from the American president, from what he has said, the Nigerian government has taken note, and people have taken note of the churches that have been burnt and Christians that have been killed up north, or just the terrorism that's going on in the northern parts of Nigeria. And it's given the Nigerian government a challenge to do a lot more. I think, though it may not have a direct consequence, just maybe, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Nigerian government changed its security heads, its security chiefs. They brought in a new group of people, a new group of commanders, so to speak, and all of them with a view to do a lot more. So my view is that I don't see the American president sending Marines into the northern Nigeria. But what I do see is that everyone has taken note that America is concerned about the situation there. And from a Christian point of view, it is important for us as Christians, especially in the security sector, to also pray for the Christians that are in the northern part of Nigeria, because they are working in an environment, not just of terrorism, but they're also working in an environment where most people are not Christians, and Christians, they want to convert them to Islam, or they see them as infidels. So it is not an easy mission field, but we need to pray for them, that maybe the Lord will protect them, and that maybe through them, those people will be converted to Christianity when they see the resilience of the Christian church there. I think that's what I would see. I would say, but maybe just to add another layer on this is that American support to Nigeria in terms of intelligence is very crucial. In terms of the assets that they bring to the counterterrorism fight is very crucial. In terms of intelligence, in terms of real-time imagery for the security services, for the security on the ground, is very crucial. And if even if they do not send troops, boots on the ground, but if they can avail to the Nigerian Defense Force more surveillance assets and more intelligence, this will really help in the fight against terrorism in the northern part of Nigeria and just the Chad basin as well. The British did that, like I said, around 2014. They provided this assistance, and it was quite noticeable. It went a long way. Then that's the first. Then the second part is, what can the Christian church do in Africa to help with this counterterrorism? As Christians in Africa, the church, in fact, the Master said, Jesus Christ said in Matthew, that the second most important commandment is that we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves. The first one is love God with all your heart. The second one is to love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. The Christian church, by showing love to the neighbor, it also helps. It brings about reconciliation. It brings about trust, because most people who are extremists do not understand God's love. And God's love is able to conquer the hard hearts of these people. Of course, like we all know, sometimes at the cost of these missionaries and churches that confront this hill. But the church can help in terms of reconciliation, because in the community, what happens? Africa is very communal, just like Europe is. Something that I've learned as an African living in Europe is that my neighbors are very observant. When I came here, after a few minutes, after a few days, they knew who I was. They knew where I worked. They are quite observant. The same things happen in Africa. In Africa, African communities know who the extremists are. And as long as community policing is involved in the fight against terrorism, we'll make more gains. The church is in the community. The work that they do in the community will draw some people to the Lord and away from extremist activities. Church projects or church small impact projects in the community will bring employment. And as it brings employment, it will give them an opportunity to share God's love and also to show an alternative, that even if the government may be failing, even if maybe the community may be disintegrating, there is still hope in the Lord Jesus Christ. And that way, they also help in the fight against terrorism. It is not easy, but it is possible.
Terrorism is often about mentality as well, huh?
Yes.
At least from a little bit of experience I have with, what happened in the Middle East. It's often also that these organizations can click into something that is already there in terms of mentality, or in terms, of course, of economic distress. What you said about community policing is very interesting, but also what you said basically about Trump, in the sense that he's simply, and I noticed the same, I saw some coming along in the media on this, and like simply his threat only was enough to give some people in Nigeria a small heart attack and suddenly wake up and do something. So maybe we in Europe should be, well, I don't think we should threaten with the invasion. That would be wrong. But we could maybe do a bit more in putting some serious pressure on some of these governments with regard to the victims actually of terrorism, how to, and that also leads to my question a little bit, very connected to this. Is it possible to empower the victims more than we do now? How could that work? Would it be possible to tell, for example, to the Nigerian government to say, look, if you want to have another dime, even another dime coming from Europe or another contract from Europe, you first need to include the Christians in the national security and give them a place, for example, via the community policing, for example. I wouldn't say that they should be outside the power structures. They should be inside the security structures, in my opinion. But would it be a good idea to put some pressure on such a government to do that? Would that work? Would that help? Because what I noticed in Syria and Iraq, the moment that people can fight back a little bit, or at least defend themselves, then the taste for terrorism suddenly decreases for some people.
That's a very interesting question. Maybe from the onset, I need to state here that we do not want to go back to the era of the Crusaders. I hope you know what I mean. We do not want to have Christians fighting Muslims. We do not want.
No, that is not. This is about community protection. No. Obviously, this is not about having some stupid war between Christians and Muslims. That would be very wrong. I'm talking about communities as a whole defending themselves, and often these are mixed communities. So
exactly, and that is very important because like you said, extremism. Most times, and from the little experience I've had, the religious dimension of it, or the extremism itself, is a narrative that people take advantage of when the people are maybe marginalized in terms of their social and economic status, in terms of decision making, because they feel marginalized, then people now will come and bring in the narrative of extremism just to maybe bring in their jihadists and their holy wars and things like that. But the root cause of it all is that mostly it's poor governance and mostly it's people that feel marginalized. Now, to put pressure on these governments in Africa is a very, very important thing that needs to be done. But as a Christian, what I would recommend is that in a community where, for instance, or in a country where there's a Christian community, and ourselves as Christians can help those Christian communities by maybe helping them with projects and also including them in community policing. I know that most governments in Europe and even in Africa, and I know this is a very delicate matter, they do not want to discuss religion and say, can you help these Christians? That's why Trump is I like Mr. Trump, he's a very brave man. He says it as it is. He doesn't mince his words in that vein. So what I would say is that it is important for the West to put pressure on African countries where they are not doing enough and tell them that, look, you are not doing enough in this area. But also, as they are pressured, it's also good to listen to them and find out why they are not doing enough and where the challenges are, and then come up with a solution that has both the interests of that particular country and the interest of the West as well. But of course, as Christians, we also worry about the welfare of the Christians that are in these countries. Like, for instance, a good example is in Nigeria, where Christians are dying. So we need to do a lot more. I'm just not sure how diplomatically that pressure can be put on another country without necessarily seeming to, for instance, showing as though you are just concerned about a particular group in the country and not the others, because terrorism affects everyone. So it's a delicate balance, but it needs to be done.
Clear enough. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Sometimes maybe people think I'm talking a lot, but then it's also because those present in under the participants are not asking many questions. So then I need to give them some time to think about this and to write their own questions. And we thank those who already did. At the moment, I don't have any questions in the question box, but maybe any one of those present might have a question. You can also maybe raise your hand and ask it. I'm also looking to Christian for a second. Like, is it possible for people to ask questions live directly? I don't know, but in any case, if you have any question, please ask, because otherwise it's a little bit too much of me here, and that's not very healthy. So I'm waiting a little bit if anybody has the courage to write a question. Maybe they are so impressed. Yes, life is possible. Life is possible is being said here by Christian. Thank you, Christian. Oh, I see a question, and that's wonderful. Any suggestions about places where you can distinguish terrorists and governments, like in Sudan? Oh, that's a good one, actually, because I've been also like, obviously, everybody was looking to Sudan and finds it absolutely horrific what is happening there. I don't think that I think we can all agree very quickly on that one. At the same time, yeah, I mean, assisting the official government of Sudan, I can imagine that some people here would also have some hesitation on that one. So a good question, actually. What do we do with those places where we hardly can distinguish the bad and the bad guys, the bad guys and the bad guys, because the ones are in the government and the other ones are terrorists. So what do we do? At least, so it seems to us. Like, this is a question from a typical European perspective, but I must, to be honest, it looks to me as well sometimes like that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And if you look at Sudan, like you said, if you look at the history of Sudan, Sudan initially was a democracy, then it went into a dictatorship, and then there was a military coup. I remember, on a lighter note, I remember I did a paper once on Sudan, and I had a backlash because I was told it was not a military coup, it was a revolution. Well, but those are semantics. But even after that so-called revolution or military coup, they still have a problem. The bottom line is this, that the people of Sudan need to choose their own leaders. Leaders should not be imposed upon the people of Sudan. Whatever is going on in Sudan it has generated into a conflict that is very complicated. Like you're saying, where now it's even difficult to tell who is legitimate between the government and the rebel. Of course, the rapid support forces, even how they came into being, you've got a country that has two parallel defense forces, and these defense forces start fighting each other. To start with, even just in normal constitutionalism, that is not supposed to be the case. You cannot have two defense forces or two armies, but separate. One from maybe with an origin from a political party, the other as part of the constitution, and then they are together. That in itself does not work, and we've seen what has happened. But be that as it may, it is very unfortunate and it is very saddening that as we speak today, I think the figures are now something like 11 million internally displaced people in Sudan. Just 2 weeks ago, when our Fasha was captured, a lot of people were displaced and some were murdered and shot. A lot of human rights abuses, a lot of rape going on. Now, this is as a result of a country that has become almost ungovernable. What is required is to sit everyone down. I know it is difficult, but then if we are to have peace in Sudan, we need to reach a point where the rebels, the so-called government, the civil society organizations, they all sit together and come up with a transition authority that will lead to maybe an election or a peaceful resolution of the conflict. It's very unfortunate because, like you rightly said, it's confusing not just for you as Europeans, even for us as Africans. And unfortunately, you find the government has got support, according to most of the documents I've seen, from Egypt, and then the UAE also is supporting the rapid support forces, though it denies this, but there appears to be evidence suggesting that.
This is going through the United Arab Emirates, and then they use also European weapons. This was in the news today.
Yes, so it's become very complicated because now, unfortunately, people, while we empathize, while we have sympathy for the people of Sudan, there are others who are making money out of this conflict, which is really, really sad because you'll find 11 million people have been displaced, a lot of people have died. And from my little research and experience, terrorism casualties are some of the most difficult to estimate because mostly they're underreported. The injuries due to such a conflict and terrorism are usually underreported. It's difficult to tell. But to answer your question, it is very important for the global actors like the United Nations, the African Union, and the regional economic communities to put pressure on both parties so that a ceasefire is signed and they all sit together to find peace. Because it is very difficult for us to imagine that in the next 2 weeks, either side is going to have a victory on the battlefield. It may take another 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years, but that is the cost of human life. So in the interest of peace, I would suggest that the African Union, the United Nations, they step in and sit both parties down, especially that there are countries that are seen to be supporting these parties. If the UAE pressure can be put on them so that they bring the RSF to the table, and also the Egypt pressure is put on them to make sure that the government also comes to the table so that there is peace. Without that, if we are to look for an ultimate victor on the battlefield, it may be difficult. I think that could be my suggestion, but it is a very, very sad state of affairs in Sudan.
No, that is not a question at all, and it seems to me as an unknowing observer that what you are suggesting seems indeed to be the most logical approach, by putting pressure on those who can put pressure on those who need to sit down, indeed, and to end the war. And I also need to mention here that actually the RSF got, of course, support from the Sudanese regime back in 2016. And that support actually came originally from the EU with the purpose to stop migration. Now, that has translated in a disaster of a terrible magnitude, as we can see now, and it shows the limit of the short-term approach. I think we're getting here the final question of this evening, and it's a very good one, actually. In your opinion, how important is climate change in the Sahel region for stability and security, and how does it translate into the growth of terrorist groups in the region, such as Boko Haram, but you can also say ASWAP and so on, of course. So I think it's a very, very good one, because you hear this more in Europe, at least, and I would love to have an African perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. The nexus between climate change and terrorism or peace and security is quite real. In Africa, the typical example that is easy to understand is that of the conflict between maybe the tribes or communities that are predominantly herders, or they keep cattle, and maybe communities that are farmers, so to speak. Now, what happens is, because the herders want to have grazing for their animals, and because of climate change, there's drought. So these tribes tend to move and encroach on land that has typically been maybe farmed by tribes that are farmers, and this has brought a lot of conflicts. And especially, I know, for instance, in Nigeria, this is a real threat, and we have seen it happen. Also, with drought, there are also the issues of the crisis in terms of energy. Most African countries depend on hydropower for energy, and with the reduced rainfall, the production of electricity has reduced, and this also has brought to people being dissatisfied with their governments, because their government is not able to supply enough power, and not because they do not want to, but because of climate change. And you know, these developments, some groups will now ride on this dissatisfaction in the population to bring about tension in countries. In fact, there's a paper I read some time back that future wars in Africa may be fought over water, because rivers are drying up. There isn't enough water, and this leads to conflicts. So indeed, in Africa, just as here in Europe, climate change is real, and it is a real threat. So these are maybe the two examples I can give. One to do with energy, and the other one to do with maybe farmers and herders. These are real conflicts that we are seeing, and people end up killing each other, and communities rise against each other. And sometimes extremist groups also take advantage of this, and it becomes part of what we are terming as terrorism. I think maybe those are the two examples that I could give. Thank you.
Well, that sounds as very real and clear examples indeed. And I was just thinking very practically, why on earth did they do hydropower when you have so much possibility for solar power? But that is just me asking probably a stupid question.
No, no, that's not a stupid question. It's the lack of investment in solar power. I think Africa has the most sun, but it has the least investment in solar. Here in Europe, for instance, on almost every other roof, you see solar panels. In Africa, this is when the investment in solar is beginning. But between the time that we've got enough investment and now, this will remain a challenge.
Yeah, I can see the point of the transition there, which is different from our bottlenecks, but basically you have everywhere bottlenecks in this. But yeah, we should therefore, one of the things we can actually do is invest in solar power. Well, that is at least a very practical thing that we can do. Having said that, I think that these were the questions, because it's going now to 8 to 10, and I think that's a really nice moment to close. It's not it's 8 to 9 in the UK, proving again that the world is round. And that the date of the time zone is between us and the UK, so then you get this. I thank everybody who joined us and who asked questions, and it was very helpful. And I thank Ruben and Christian for their help. And first and foremost, and not first, but at least foremost, I thank you, Mr. Stefan Kabanda, General, for your excellent points that you made here this evening, and for your so helpful sharing of your experience with all of us. And we need more of this kind of a sharing of experience from your continent, so that we can start to look from the inside out, instead of from the outside in. And this is really, again, as I see it again, only if we have voices like yours who can tell us how it is, and then we are able to look a little bit more from the inside out, instead of from the outside in. And this is extremely helpful. Thank you so much for everything you shared with us this evening. And hopefully we can continue this partnership in one way or another, because we need to spread and share this experience with many, many more people. And again, I thank all those who joined us this evening, and thank you for your questioning and your interest. And hopefully we'll see you again in the next webinar that will come at some point. So please subscribe for the Sallux newsletter, so that you will be alerted for the next time that we have an event. And also, I would again encourage you to look at, you all received an email, and there were some links in that email to the books of Sallux that we already written on this. And we were very grateful for those who did write already for us on these topics. And this gives a little bit more of perspective as well, of a bigger picture. So having all said that, I thank all those participating, and I would like to ask them participants now to leave, so that we can close here as well. And thank you for joining us this evening.